How can a man dream of peace, of freedom, of a better world when he has never experienced them? He is, in essence, a prisoner of his own limitations. This is the story of a man marked by his own anxieties. Anxieties which are the product of the world he inhabits, a world far removed from the memories of his childhood. The national war was fought constantly. There were no longer allies to identify with, only enemies. Disputes were fought desperately, savagely, and intensely, with the highest loss of life. War minister strategies were likened to using oxygen in order to extinguish fires. They were only adding more fuel for destruction. The foreign threat was constant, and the government, more than ever, needed to keep surveillance and control of its people. Many freedoms were sacrificed in order to keep the country running. Questions were not encouraged because they were counterproductive. The current government stayed in power because they felt democracy was archaic and it slowed down progress. A man just as remarkable as any other, houses the same thoughts as any other, shares the same inspirations as any other, but his actions are what defines him. What he chooses to do with the same basic instructions we have is what makes somebody unremarkable remarkable. Walking down the same streets he had passed so many times before, with frost and exhaust fumes filling the air, he was without a purpose. He wandered aimlessly as a person with too much free time often does, but today had the potential for difference, as did the thousands of days before now. Loneliness was causing him to slowly lose his mind, but as fortune would have it, this happened to coincide with a mystical ability to have his thoughts manifest into reality. His crude and often self-centered imagination was slowly leaking into the world like a septic tank slowly leaks into a town's drinking water. He was alone in the centre of town, and he imagined people were there too, so he wouldn't have to be by himself again. They came in an instant without hesitation, and they were unfazed by the sudden materialisation into the city centre, as if it was always their intention to be there today. He stood for a while, and glanced up at the clock in the middle of town. He then began to observe the masses of people before him, knowing that somewhere in this great herd of humans was the woman he so desperately sought. He looked upon them with a feeling of gratitude, being thankful for the opportunity to pursue what he wanted, and this was the feeling that sustained his existence. He knew she was there because he had followed her down, but then somehow lost her. Dread hit the pit of the stomach as the reality of another wasted day began to take effect. As he looked down, he saw a pair of familiar shoes that sparked hope. From a distance, he saw her turning towards the lesser travelled parts of town. He pursued her with great hesitation. She went into a cafe, and he waited for a few moments before going in himself. His heart was racing. Never before had he been so close to her. He felt like he could hear everything she was thinking. It overwhelmed him to be this close. He ordered a coffee and took a seat at an observable distance to her. The new government allowed their citizens the freedom of having a small allowance with which they were allowed to do with as they pleased. He watched her put 5 sachets of sugar in her coffee, which she stirred vacantly. He mirrored her movements with his spoon, and she looked over at him. She got up and walked over and asked if she could borrow the newspaper. He obliged, but said boldly, "Only if I can join you." Looking down at him, she agreed with some trepidation, more agreeing out of awkwardness than want. So he walked over with her, and he got so close behind her so that he could smell her hair as they walked. They sat down, and she read the newspaper, but he stared right through it to her eyes. He took a sip of coffee and winced as the taste registered bitterly on his tongue. He asked her questions such as her name, her age, and asked her of her plans. She responded that her name was Mary, and she was 24. She coolly responded to the latter that it was foolish to make plans these days. Mary didn't ask many personal details. She instead asked him what he made of the view from the window. He said he liked it, but only because he assumed that it was what she wanted to hear. In truth, he hated it. It reminded him of his anxieties of a world outside confined spaces. This was why he had bolted up all the windows in his house and chose to come out only when it was necessary. She contentiously said she disliked it. It reminded her of a funeral she went to in Prague. He was pretending to listen, uttering nondescript responses at pauses in her stories, but his full attention was now on his hand, which was steadily creeping towards Mary's, whose hand rested on the table clutching a cigarette. Closer and closer his hand got. His tension was filling up in his head. Close still, but again out of reach. The tips of his fingers desperately struggling to make the last few inches for contact. Thoughts were screaming at him to stop, but he pushed against their invisible resistance and continued to reach out slowly and slowly. She hadn't noticed yet, and it was only half an inch from contact. She shot a glance down, oblivious to the struggle that was occurring on the table. She said, "Oh, how rude of me. Would you like a cigarette?" Mary had considered the bizarre nature of this incident, but had chosen to infer the more normal reading of it because she was too horrified to believe the other as a possibility. He looked back at her, almost frightened, and ran out of the cafe, fearing what he was becoming, as anxiety flooded his system again. He needed to get home. The house was an exoskeleton, a shell to protect his frail body from the roughness of the world outside it. Truly he was a hermit. The windows were boarded up to stop himself from seeing too much of the world outside of them. Lately, he had taken to sleepwalking, so he began to chain himself to the bed most nights in order to prevent his body from trying to escape. A siren sounded outside, and this was a warning for everyone to switch to the news. Watching wasn't considered compulsory, but if you didn't, your rations would be reduced severely. He plugged himself into the television and switched off his brain. A man was sat in the chair, staring into the cameras at the viewers.
Good evening, everyone. This is the Voice of England. Our top story tonight. New scientific research published today suggests that overthinking can lead to cancer in adolescence. Also, we'll look at why foreigners' small brain capacities make them so aggressive.
The news carried on in this fashion for a full hour while he prayed for it to end. He tried to close his eye, but every time he did, a high-pitched screeching noise would sound in order to maintain focus. Finally, it ended with a man still staring into the camera.
Tonight's winning lottery numbers were 2, 4, and 21. We end, as always, by saying, remember to keep an eye out for suspicious activity and to take your Tranquilex. Have a good sleep, everyone. And remember, keep calm and carry Tranquilex.
Tranquilex. That was the government-backed Wonder Drug, which induced a regulated 7.5-hour sleep. It didn't used to be mandatory, but after the big sleep campaign, it was felt it was in the public's best interest to take it, under the slogan, keep calm and carry Tranquilex. For a well-rested country is an alert country, and you never knew when the foreign threat was going to strike back again. Side effects included, but were not limited to, obedience, indifference, and misdirected anger. 2 years of peacetime was longer than anyone could have imagined. He chained himself to the bed and took the drug. Several weeks later, he arose and left the house again, with more control this time. He marched down into town and found her. Mary was standing against the wall, smoking. He approached her and asked if she remembered him. She did, and they chatted for some time about common interests and common fears. Finally, Mary said, "Come away with me." He asked where they should go, and she said, "Let's go to a place where the whispers stop." He said he could take her to such a place, but it came at a price. She said she didn't care. She just wanted the voices to stop. He said okay, and imagined a world where only they existed in a vacuous room devoid of anything. The same manipulation that brought the people into the centre of town now changed their surroundings into his imagined reality. She gasped at him, and she looked around and questioned why he didn't just imagine a world without war in it, and he said he lacked the imagination to do so. They sat for a while in this vacuous space, not talking, just taking in the quiet reverberations that their ears hadn't been able to hear in their entire existence. But he noticed that the room was not completely devoid. He could hear a mild beating. In the corner, his eyes observed a small black box. He walked over to it and opened it gently. He didn't know what he was supposed to be looking at. It was filled with red liquid, which he was cautious not to spill. And floating in the middle was a beating heart. He placed it down and withdrew in sheer horror. He couldn't understand what it was doing there, or whom it belonged to. Mary came over and asked what the hell it was, and he said he did not know. He jumped in front of it like a guardian. He did not know why. She demanded to take a look, and he refused her access. Aggression filled her, and she managed to shove him out of the way. Sinking her hand into the liquid, she grasped the heart tightly and took it out of the box. When she squeezed it, he winced in pain. "Stop!" he cried in fear. A twisted smile spread across her face, and she threw it to the ground and stomped on it. He hit the floor, grasping at his chest, wondering why. He uttered his last breath, saying only, "I gave her my heart, but she just wanted my soul. We are all monsters." What he realised was that the poisons that existed within the world were already coursing through them both, and they could leave physically, but the parasitic ideas that existed inside of them could not be removed so easily. There was a reason he couldn't imagine a world without war. Mary too realised that he was the only thing that could have brought back the horrors of the old world, so she decided to make a deal with the universe and rid it of her blood-sucking existence. For 2 minutes, she became the sole conduit of all the information that ever existed, or will ever exist again.